So that's a picture. Let's now have the discussion in Beijing. Joining us is Andy Mock, a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization think tank. In Washington, D.C., Neil Thomas stands by, a fellow on Chinese politics at the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. And in L.A. and Los Angeles in the United States, William Lee, chief economist at the Milken Institute. A warm welcome to each one of you. And Andy Mock, I'd like to start with you in Beijing. We have this stabilization, if you like, of relations, a kind of tactical truce. How does Beijing view its position now?
Well, Nick, I think that Beijing really isn't centered on the China-U.S. conflict per se. So China's focused on long-term development. It has two goals by 2049 to achieve what it calls the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, where China's global presence is commensurate with its civilizational weight, and 2035, which is the intermediate goal, when it achieves the toolkit to reach the centennial goal of 2049. And I think the outgrowth of that is the ability to stand up to the U.S., to protect its legitimate rights. And as we've seen, I think, force the U.S. to back down from its more aggressive actions to try to intimidate China.
So that is what you think has happened, that the U.S. has backed down?
I do, yes.
William Lee, what do you make out of that? And also the fact that 12 out of 10 is what Donald Trump, how he characterized this meeting. Would you give such a glowing report card?
Well, it's very good that we have a meeting that has de-escalated tensions. It's good that we've had a long period of de-escalation ahead of us after some very provocative steps by China to leverage its monopoly positions in supply chains that are critical to the modern production in rare earths and the technology surrounding rare earths. And as far as Andy's historical sweeping assessments are concerned, that is the usual Chinese rhetoric that we hear over and over again. It's well said, and Andy's excellent in propagating that storyline. Unfortunately, none of it's true, at least from the U.S. perspective. The U.S. has never had the interest of containing China. In fact, it's really gone out of its way to try to develop with China to provide exports of technologies and financial services and key missing ingredients to help China develop as a modern 21st century large economy.
But William, in this case, hasn't China actually muscled up to Donald Trump's threats and has won, or at least they haven't lost?
We have two leaders here of the two largest economies in the world that have to appeal not only to a global audience, but also to a domestic audience. Donald Trump, of course, has been trying to say over and over again that he and President Xi have got great relationships and they respect each other and understand where each other's coming from. But their domestic audience has to be shown, at least I believe from President Xi's perspective, that he wants to have the United States come on its knees to beg for access to the critical areas where China has achieved its monopoly position in production of rare earths, which is a technological lead that it has over the U.S. Unfortunately, the way it's applied these export restrictions is to really a blanket restriction on the entire world, and whereas where the United States has limited export controls, it's always been very strategic, aimed at particularly China, where we want to limit the military uses of some of our strategic technologies. So the differences, I think, are very stark when you look at them. And I think the accusations against the U.S. by China, especially these long lectures about historical imperialism, are really out of line.
Neil Thomas, what do you make of it all? It's been quite a year. It was only 6 months ago or so that both sides had imposed tariffs of over 100% on each other. And really isn't what was announced over these talks simply a resetting of conditions to what they were before the dispute flared up?
Yes, what we have here coming out of South Korea is a non-binding truce between the United States and China in their economic competition. It's a long way from a binding ceasefire and a million miles off an armistice that would see the US and China cooperating in peace and prosperity without any friction. So I expect this will be the first of many truces that are negotiated between the two sides as various economic and also security issues flare up and disrupt the détente, maybe the temporary détente we've reached right now.
And Andy, you wrote that the United States, and you alluded to it just now, must regard China as a peer now, perhaps even in a superior position. Could you expand on that? And then we'll bring in William to respond.
Yeah, Nick. So, I think that when we look at the list of leverage points that China has over the U.S., of course, we spend a lot of time talking about rare earth metals. And I think it's worth pointing out to reply to what William said, is that China's response to the U.S. has been very measured and calibrated and really mirrors the moves first taken by the U.S. But let me just continue. So it's rare earth metals. There's soybeans, of course, which we've been talking about a lot lately. But there's also Boeing jets as well. So we have to recognize that China is one of the largest markets for Boeing. And Boeing is not just a civilian aircraft maker, but it is also a cornerstone of the U.S. military industrial establishment. So, I think China has the ability to exert a lot of leverage on the U.S. And the list goes on: APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it really, that's, I think, a growing recognition in the U.S. that from an economic perspective, that China has a number of leverage points over the U.S. When we look at it from a military perspective, the U.S. has about 300 ships that needs to cover missions for about 600 ships all around the world. China now exceeds the number of total ships, has a greater number than the U.S. Navy. While the tonnage is lower, the average age is about 13 years versus 20 years plus. And it's also a very focused mission as well. So I think when we look at all of these together, I think it's not surprising that the U.S. really has to come to terms with this idea that it is not the sole author of global rules anymore, and that really has to make room for another country of comparable heft. And I think this is emotionally and psychologically very challenging for some people in the U.S.
William, what do you make of that? What's your response to that? The U.S. is now dealing with China as a peer.
I think the U.S. has been applauding China's remarkable progress in the last 10 years to become the leading edge of technology producers in very critical technologies, solar panels, electric vehicles, places where the United States really did not have that lead to set standards, and China is now the standard setter for very, very important industries. So that's well known, and I think that's something that at least investors in the U.S. has been applauding and been wanting to participate in. In fact, I used to work at Citibank, and we've been in China for 100 years or more, and we've been wanting to sell more financial services into China, but been limited by regulation. So the United States has been wanting to participate in China's development for quite a long time now, but unfortunately, the restrictions that China has imposed for its own reasons of wanting to build its own national champions have excluded the U.S. from a lot of these markets. Now, Andy's absolutely right that Boeing is a very important aircraft manufacturer, but so is Airbus. So the Europeans and the Americans also have these major production of aircraft, and China is starting to come along with its own industry. So that's a natural development. But what has been disruptive has been that China's model of economic development has been so effective producing stuff and not so good at consuming the production it has made, that China's growth now depends critically on exporting its production to the rest of the world. And I think Donald Trump has been trying to change the shape of world trade by saying, you don't need to just export stuff. You can just export your factories of production, capital, invest in other countries, produce jobs in other countries, and you'll be welcome. And that's exactly the policy that President Trump has put in place. The Make America Great agenda has been to reduce the size of government, lower taxes, have fewer regulations, to invite investors in. And they said, if you invest in the United States and produce here and create jobs here, we'll give you a protective tariff barrier to protect you from unfair competition. Whereas China has insisted on dumping its exports into the rest of the world because it has so much production at home, and its domestic consumers are not able to consume.
So Andy, just come back very briefly on that, if you would.
Well, a couple of things. I think Bill makes some good points. And first, I have to say that The U.S. is not monolithic, so certainly Wall Street, I think, has a much more realistic, pragmatic view towards China, and certainly sees the business and investment opportunities there. I absolutely agree with that. But I think the DC view is very, very different. And of course, that is also not entirely monolithic, but we have seen a bipartisan consensus that China is a threat. Some would characterize it as an existential threat to the United States. Around consumption, I would say this. I think that the world, largely because of American soft power, has normalized American consumption as sort of the way things should be. And I think we can actually see it as incredibly unhealthy. Look at American obesity. Look at other issues that the US has. That I'm not sure that if we look at it as a percentage of GDP, say, that really is the target that China or any other country should be aiming for. And the Chinese approach, as I'm sure we all know, is really to put industrial might, advanced manufacturing first. And that will, the byproduct of that will be a more prosperous, stable society for the citizens, the consumers of the country.
Neil Thomas, back to you and back to the conversation at hand specifically, which was at this summit and to the main event, as we've already alluded to. This is the issue of rare earths, and China will suspend for a year the implementation of export control measures, as you know. And Neil, on the face of it, that, I guess, could be seen as a win for the United States, but it does give China significant leverage going forward, doesn't it? A kind of sort of Damocles, if you like, hanging over the US that China can just employ when it needs to.
Exactly. Beijing has seen just how effective export controls can be as tools of economic diplomacy. It was at the pointy end of many American export controls over the last few years, which really threatened to shut down some of China's national champions like ZTE and Huawei. And that spurred a huge rethink of China's own approach to globalization and a really turbocharged an agenda of industrial self-reliance, which is feeding into some of these issues that Andy and Bill were discussing. When it comes to these rare earth export controls in particular, they are unprecedented in their scope. They're a global export control, so anyone, anywhere using trace amounts of Chinese processed rare earths in particular goods is going to have to apply for licenses from Beijing to use them. And the issue that China would face if it introduced those export controls right now is that it just doesn't have the bureaucratic capacity to implement those in terms of staff and training and experience to mean that they could be applied without slowing down global supply chains, of which China is a beneficiary and a part, and which would alienate a huge amount of other countries. So this pause does potentially give Beijing the space to work out how it could actually implement these, build up that capacity, and to actually have a more credible and effective export control lever to pull when all of this gets renegotiated in 1 year's time.
Right, okay. Is that what it's all about, Bill? Is it sort of about buying time? Because, of course, down the line, China's hold on rare earths won't last forever. But for now, it is a powerful negotiating tool in their quiver.
Exactly. I think the most optimistic estimates for how long it will take the US and its allies and partners to gain a measure of supply chain independence in key rare earths is about 5 years. I think the median is probably somewhere around 10 to 15 years in terms of the estimates out there, depending on the scope of rare earths you look at. I mean, there are literally dozens and dozens of these different elements, all with different supply chains. So it's a massive undertaking. We've seen the Trump administration take some steps in the right direction to deepen cooperation with Australia and with Southeast Asian nations on rare earth mining and processing. But China really, holds the whip hand here, and the blockage is not in, actually controlling rare earths. China has 70% of the mining, 90% of the processing worldwide. The block is how can we actually.
So, William, what do you make of that? China has the whip hand.
I think Neil is spot on. China's negotiating strategy has always been to buy more time for it to really reestablish its monopoly positions in the global supply chains, but also to not honor its past obligations. Remember, it was the phase one deal under the first Trump administration where China promised to buy soybeans, and it stalled and never really fulfilled its obligations. And right now it's stalling again because they're waiting for the crop in Brazil to come online in February to crash world prices. And China has put a nice term in the agreement that says we will buy at fair market prices, whatever they are. And once Brazil's supply comes online, and having delayed the American exports until then, they're going to reap a tremendous bargain. So the strategy that China has used
that's all about negotiating strategy, isn't it? I mean, that's just good negotiating, isn't it?
And I applaud China for doing that, but recognize that it's doing this not in the interest of maintaining supply and stabilizing the world, but to better China itself, which is a good thing. They should do that. And American negotiators should be much harder line about insisting that China fulfill its obligations from phase one, not only the current obligations of buying American soybeans.
Andy, what was not in the talks, at least publicly, was interesting, wasn't it? What struck you most there, particularly the lack of any mention of Taiwan?
Well, Nick, first I want to say that, just bigger picture here, I think time is on China's side, and the different structure of government only reinforces this advantage. So I think China has the advantage of what we could call unity of command, meaning there's a direct line of authority from Zhongnanhai to the province, to the city, even down to the neighborhood level. And when we see that, we see that China has a faster OODA loop, so observe, orient, decide, act. And so this compounds this idea that time is on their side. And I think this is a very, very powerful dynamic to bear in mind with respect to Taiwan as well. So I think the point here is, while Taiwan was not publicly mentioned, that doesn't mean it was not privately discussed. And, in my earlier point, I said about the comparison between the Chinese and the U.S. Navy. We also have to look at China as hypersonics. It has a number of weapon systems specifically designed to be what are so-called carrier killers. The joke is that, you don't fear, as Bruce Lee said, I don't fear the man who knows 10,000 kicks. I fear the man who's practiced one kick 10,000 times, right? So the U.S. has a wide variety of scenarios, security commitments around the world. China really has one, and it's really been focused on this particular one for decades. So, and I think Donald Trump has said this too in his first term, with the map saying Taiwan is 90 miles away from China, it's thousands of miles away from the U.S. What the F are we going to do? It wouldn't surprise me if something were discussed privately and at the proper time will be publicly disclosed.
Okay, Neil, what do you make of that? The crunch issues like Taiwan, like the issues in the South China Sea, not on the table publicly, as Andy was saying, but yet could be something that derails the process.
Exactly. So right now, I don't think the Trump administration or Xi Jinping in Beijing saw much upside to having a really in-depth to and fro on Taiwan or the South China Sea. Both sides were focused on doing a narrower economic deal in South Korea. But if we look at the year ahead, which is the period that this truce is meant to last, that hasn't addressed any of these bigger picture disagreements over China's military presence in the Taiwan Strait, in the South China Sea. The US has traditionally been the guarantor of security there. A lot of people in the administration, and I think to some extent Trump himself, also believes that America should remain a top power there. I mean, we still have huge amounts of US troops, ships, missiles, etc. in the region. And despite what Trump said about allies needing to pay more for their defense, he hasn't actually gone through with any of the big reallocations of American military resources that some people have floated. And so, if there is a situation where, say, the US sells some arms to Taiwan, or maybe China harasses some American ships in the South China Sea, there's all sorts of things that could happen that could land on Xi's desk or Trump's desk and make them think, this isn't tolerable. We need to push back. And what tools do you have to push back? You have these economic tools. You have tariffs, sanctions, export controls. And so I'd be surprised if there's not some kind of bump in the road in the next 12 months.
Right. William, as we draw this conversation to a close, is it less about who has the upper hand now and more about who's better positioned to dig in for the long term?
The key issue going forward is going to be for the world to understand the two models of economic development that are being offered by China and the United States. China, as Andy has just said, right, is interested in development of China. And I've just warned everyone that whatever obligations you enter into, whatever agreements you enter into with China bilaterally, watch out because they won't honor the obligations unless it's to their benefit. And the model of Chinese hegemony has been to create a trail of economic dependencies, whether it's port facilities in Africa, energy facilities in Asia, or all of the investments that is made in Eastern Europe. These are to create economic dependencies on which China will exploit its monopoly supply positions. And that's a model of economic development that I think the world should watch out as opposed to the guarantees of sovereignty and independence that the United States is offering.
There is history there, isn't there? The precedents, Andy, for China not living up to its agreements. Back in 2020, Trump signed what he called a historical trade deal, committing China to purchase, I think, what was it, $200 billion worth in excess additional US exports before the end of 2021. And in the event that China only actually completed 58%.
Sure, but I think there were extenuating circumstances there. But I think it's more important to respond to Bill's point here. And I think he does an excellent job of articulating the U.S. Set of fears and anxieties that it is projecting onto China. So, the U.S. cosmology from an international relations perspective it's very hierarchical. And if you're not the leader, you're in trouble. I think the Chinese view is actually much more different. And if you listen carefully to the speeches by people like President Xi, it's really a very, very different cosmology. It's, the U.S. needs to prosper, China needs to prosper. It's like one is the heart, one is the brain or the lung. You can't say, the heart needs to dominate the lung, but they're all part of one system that really needs to be balanced. And that balance is not static, but it's dynamic. And I think that's how I would interpret President Xi's remarks that, these are two big countries. It's natural to have friction. We need to rebalance constantly. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Gentlemen, great discussion. Appreciate that very much. Thank you all, Andy Mock, Neil Thomas and William Lee. And thank you too for watching. You can see this program again at any time by visiting our website. aljazeera.com is the address. And for further discussion, just go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ.